Uh, we're here on our last little bit of lessons about evolution. And today, and probably a bit of tomorrow's class, will be the last little bit of notes that we have to go through. So we've been talking about evolution and my profession that it happened. So we need to give you a bunch of evidence to help support this scientific theory. There's two major divisions of the evidence that we have for evolution: direct and indirect. Now, it's important to distinguish between the two because direct evidence means I have physical proof that this organism existed at this time and this other organism existed at this other time. That's a little bit more concrete. We also have microevolution, and I've mentioned that before. We talked about moths and how there was a different color of them, and I'll repeat that in here. Then there is a bunch of indirect evidence where we have to make an inference. Making an inference means obviously that there's room for error. And so some of the things that I'm going to show you in the indirect section are not hard, solid, factual proof, but when you take them all together, they do provide a pretty logical picture that would help explain that organisms have a common ancestor. So in this entire section, we are going to try to explain whether or not two organisms have a common ancestor. Now, one point that I should make before we start is that based on the theory of evolution, all organisms have a common ancestor. There would have been one cell that started it all, and every other cell would have come from that cell. When I say common ancestor, in this section in particular, I'm really referring to a much closer common ancestor. For example, humans and apes appear to have a much closer common ancestor than humans and oak trees, even though we do share a lot of characteristics with the cells that are found in an oak tree. So when we talk about common ancestor, we're really looking for the close relationship. And then I put this hilarious picture that is often part of jokes about evolution that show a man evolving from an ape, being able to walk upright, and then going back to being down, crouched down in front of a computer. It's called the devolution of man. There's lots of cartoons like this. This is not true. This is just for jokes. So this is not any sort of real scientific thing. So we're going to start by talking about fossils. You already know a little bit about fossils because we mentioned them previously. A fossil is the imprint left behind by an organism. It does not have to be an animal. It can be any type of living organism, although animals seem to be the ones that people are interested in the most. But we can find fossils of plants as well. Now, the important thing to know about fossils, if we're going to use fossils as evidence for evolution, is that not all organisms form fossils. And that's a pretty big deal. So underneath, I have the list of conditions that are necessary for a fossil to form. So a fossil will only form when, one, the organism is buried quickly. So, probably for many organisms, this would be relatively true. They die and their body is covered by natural processes or other organisms covering it up. But for many organisms, that could probably be true. Then it has to decay, leaving spaces. There would be fewer organisms. So of those that were buried quickly, less of them will decay, leaving spaces. And then there's the third condition, where I could say the least organisms. Of the ones that were buried quickly and decayed to leave spaces, only a select few will have spaces that are filled with silt and minerals over the years. Then their bones or materials could become rock, and that's when you get the fossil. So, do we have a fossil record of every organism that ever existed? Absolutely not. The other inference that we could make from this is that there are probably many organisms not represented by fossils. There are probably a bunch of organisms that existed that we don't have a fossil for and that we might never know existed. So fossils are great, but they definitely don't show the whole entire picture. So we couldn't possibly just use fossils. They are quite useful, though, for figuring out when an organism existed. We mentioned previously when we talked about fossils in the first place that you could carbon date them, figure out how old they are based on how much radioactive carbon they have. This is very precise. If we wanted to be a little bit more general about fossils, we would say that near the surface, you found more recent fossils, and the deeper you went, the older the fossils got. And that is a pretty good generalization. Carbon dating just makes it much more precise as to how old is. Now the next slide shows a little bit about what we have learned from the fossil record. And I want to start by saying, I do not expect you to memorize the names of all of the periods in geological history. I don't expect that you know at what point in time every organism appeared or disappeared. But I do want you to recognize what is going on. Every period in geological history is characterized by different life forms. And so I have this picture here just to help represent what the different types of life forms are. And I'm just going to point out a few examples of where there were really big changes so that you can see that that's sort of how these time periods were decided upon. I'm going to remind you about George Cuvier, who was the father of paleontology. He talked about how there were revolutions where organisms would appear or disappear from the fossil record. And that's what we're trying to illustrate here, that each period of time is characterized by different life forms. So if I start way down here, 650 million years ago, this is when we really see the first traces of any sort of animal type structure existing. And then every time we switch to a new time period, you can see that either something has arrived, it's the first time that you see something, or we could see that something disappears. So in each of these time periods, there's distinct either appearances or disappearances of organisms. I'm not asking you to memorize all of them, but to get the basic idea that as we move through time, organisms show up, organisms disappear from the fossil record. I do just want to point out where we are on this list. Look at all the stuff that showed up before us. So there is no evidence of human evolution before a little over 1 million and a bit years ago. And you see there's a big space here. We kind of chopped this so that we could even fit humans on this scale, because otherwise our percentage of this whole evolution scale is so small that it's fairly insignificant. So this is called the geologic time scale. And it helps us illustrate the idea that over time, the organisms that have existed have been different. The next thing that we'll mention is biogeographical distribution. So what does bio mean? Life. What does geo mean? Earth. And then the word distribution. So what is the distribution of life on Earth? What we're really getting at here is the environmental role or effect. In other words, natural selection. What we see is that where an organism lives appears to have a lot to do with how the organism acts or what kind of functions it's able to accomplish. So I've got a couple of examples to help illustrate how environment and distribution seem to help us explain that natural selection very probably happened. In example number 1, we're talking about big flightless birds. You've probably maybe heard of an emu or an ostrich before. A rhea is just a very similar looking bird. All of these birds, they lack this little hook on their sternum. If I could write it. It means that they don't have the right bone structure to make wings fly. Even if wings started to grow, they wouldn't be able to make them flap. And here's what we know about these big flightless birds. It would appear that they all originated on one supercontinent. Now, when I say supercontinent, this is me referring to the past, when the continents as we know them now were attached in a much larger group. The other evidence that we have would suggest that they all evolved independently. What does that mean? That means that the environment that they were in caused these 3 birds separately to all develop flightlessness. So we are talking about having the same selective pressure. Selective pressure is what is determining whether an organism gets to survive and reproduce. And so these birds, which don't all exist in the same place now, seem to have things in common with each other, so they must have a common ancestor, but it looks like their environments were similar enough that they evolved the same way, even though they were not all in the same place when the evolving was happening. Now, the other example might be one that you're a little bit more familiar with. It's the idea of different types of mammals. Now, you're probably familiar with what we would call a placental mammal. That's us. We are placental mammals. Placental mammals like humans, cats, dogs, dolphins, whales, etc., give birth to live young. That would be the very distinctive characteristic that happens. Correct. Correct. So, placental mammals give birth to live young, and the live young don't go anywhere else after that. The difference between a placental mammal and a marsupial one, marsupials, which is what a kangaroo is, marsupials have pouches. Now here's what happens. It's actually kind of sad. I watched a show about this once. When a marsupial is born, the very small baby, in my mind, it sort of seemed like the baby was born prematurely because it wasn't totally done developing yet. But this is how it is for marsupials. The baby is born, it's live, and it has to make its way into the pouch. And if it doesn't get there, the mother doesn't help it get there. It was very cold seeming. It made me feel sad. Like, why wouldn't the mom kangaroo just pick up the baby kangaroo and put it in her pouch? She leaves like a trail of saliva for the baby to follow. But if that one doesn't work, a lot of the time they have a second egg on the go, and that one will just develop then if the first one doesn't. Anyways, the baby goes into the pouch if it manages to make it there and not break your heart. And then it develops more. So there is a nipple inside there where it can receive nutrition. So if I was making sort of an analogy, it's like it got born too early and then it had to go back in the pouch to finish developing. Uh, marsupials live in Australia, except for one sort of exception to all of that. Yes, you have a question. I'll have to see if I can find that. It wasn't something that I watched recently. Sure, baby kangaroo dying, or it's probably what you'd want to search. Now, marsupials, with really one exception, live in Australia. So there's a very distinct separation. Monotreme mammals lay eggs, which seems weird. The young is alive, but it's inside of an egg. It's just a slightly different way of giving birth. So all mammals give birth to live young, but marsupials and monotremes have like this extra little bit that goes along with their babies being born. So I'm just going to pause. Now there are a ton of other examples where we could talk about the distribution of organisms. I'll mention one more down here. The idea of penguins and where they do and don't live is sort of the opposite between penguins and polar bears. Anybody know where they live? What's the difference between penguins and polar bears? Yeah? That's correct. So you would say that these organisms have basically the same environment, right? Freezing cold. But you do not find penguins in the Arctic, and you do not find polar bears in the Antarctic. And so that's another example of organisms being distributed differently. What caused that distribution? Well, maybe when the supercontinents separated, one went one way, one went the other way, and there was no selective pressure to have one versus the other. Now, you would think that we could because the environment is very similar if we just talk about abiotic conditions. But if we talk about biotic conditions, which I'll just write down here, it's very different because of the complex food web that they would both be a part of. And so, yes, the temperature and the climate is very similar, but aside from that, all the other organisms that are there are very different, and it would be really difficult to successfully transplant organisms like that. The other thing that I will mention about marsupials and mammals, because I just thought it here as I answered this question, I've often read that marsupials cannot outcompete a placental mammal. And so if I were to introduce a placental mammal into the environment of a marsupial, the placental mammal usually is the one that would win the competition. And that provides further proof that the environment was making a difference in terms of characteristics. Now this is the section that I would like to complete today, and I think we will. There's this slide and another slide after it. It's called Comparative Anatomy. When we talk about how closely or how far apart organisms are in terms of their relationship, we could talk about the structures that they have. And so in this example, let's take a look at the bones where there are 5 basic sections of bone. All 4 of these organs, human, cat, whale, bat, are very closely related to each other. If we look at the classification scheme, they all fall under the same kingdom, phylum, order, and class, so they have lots of levels in common. And one of the things that we could use to prove that is the internal structure of their extremities. Now, even though on the surface it doesn't look like a human's arm, a cat's paw, a whale's fin, or a bat's wing are really very similar, inside, if we look, they all have, at the beginning, one large bone structure that attaches their extremity to the rest of their body. That is followed in every single one of them by this group of 2 bones. So on my copy, it's kind of a yellow one and a white one. But there's always one big bone, then 2 parallel bones after it. Then there is always the part where the articulation happens. So think about like where your wrist is, where things can move there. And then after that, there is the part with the digits. And there are always 5 of them, even if you don't see all 5 of them. So on a human's hand, you have your 4 fingers and your thumb. On a cat's paw, very often you might only see the 4 claws in the front, but it's because there's a claw at the back called the dude claw. Evolutionarily speaking, I watch a lot of shows, I guess, about animals. I watched this one about like giant cats, and that's how a lot of them hook onto their prey, is with this back claw, because it's really long and really sharp, and it allows them to like pierce the skin and hold on. So when I showed you some lions attacking an elephant, that's how they were grabbing onto the elephant's skin, was with that claw. In the whale, it really only looks from the outside like there's one thing, because all you see is the fin. But if you were to look in the internal structure, you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. And the same thing for the bat's wing. You can't see it because there's a wing here. But if you were to look inside the wing, there would be 5 structures. So, do these organisms have the same function now? They certainly don't. We would call this divergence. They started out with a similar origin, but their different environments caused them to have different functions now. These are called homologous structures, where the part at the beginning that says homo means same. Homologous structures then have the same origin, but different uses, and their different uses we could explain based on their environment and the selective pressure that exists. So whereas a whale needed to be able to swim, so a fin was more advantageous, a bat needed to be able to fly, so the wing was more advantageous. The selective pressure, remember, is what is allowing organisms to survive and reproduce, or what is not allowing them to survive and reproduce. Now the flip side of this is what we call analogous structures. So they're not the same in origin. They have a similar function, or we could say appearance. So they appear like they're doing the same thing, but if we were to look at the internal structure, it would not be the same. So down here, we're indicating that there was the same selection pressure. In other words, something about the environment was the same for all of these organisms. So you have insect wings, bird wings, dinosaur wings, bat wings, and if I look inside of them, they definitely do not look the same. So we're illustrating that we have different skeletal structures. So 2 organisms that have an analogous structure would not originate as closely from the same organism. Now remember I said we think all organisms probably originate from the same place. So when I say things don't have the same origin, I mean it's not very close, the origin that they have.